G'day everyone, and welcome back to this latest episode of Free Kick, the AFLW Fantasy Podcast. I'm Will, and today I'm joined by my co-host Liam. How's it going?
G'day, Will. I am going excellently. How are you?
I'm very well, and you must be extra excited today because we are at a critical juncture in our Clubs in Day series.
Yeah, well, we're at the most important episode of the year. Well, let's just be real. Like, it's not, forwards, mids, no. It's the Bombers. It's the Bombers Clubs in Days episode, and we've got another Bomber interview, and I'm bloody keen.
Yes, Liam's been very, very excited for this one, so let's launch into it. Liam, can you give us a bit of a history of the Bombers, brief though it may be?
Yeah, have you got a spare 4 or 5 hours? Let's just run through it game by game, I reckon.
Very nice. This is going to require a lot of editing, but we'll see what happens.
And Will, I've just taught you how to edit, so maybe this is your first go.
Very exciting. 4 hours worth of content. Here we go.
So, Bombers were an expansion side last year and looked bloody good, I must say. Finished 10th on the ladder at 16 points, but were unlucky not to have had 2 more wins after going down in some pretty agonising close losses to Carlton and Richmond by less than a goal. I'm going to say it comfortably the best expansion side last year.
I would agree with that.
I don't know if any other team looked nearly as good. Maybe, the couple of times the Hawks, I'm really not sure that anyone looked as good as the Bombers last year. And that being said, there were still some holes and have gone out and recruited very specifically for key defenders. So have brought in Brooke Brown from North Melbourne as a key intercept defender, and then also signed Brooke Walker from Carlton, and then also Georgia Clark, a former Geelong player, as well as a defender. So the Bombers have really looked to shore up their defensive stocks because, love them as we do. Danielle Marshall is not at all intercept defending, as good as she looked at points last year. And Elise Gamble was injured for large portions of the year. So it's a very targeted recruiting, alongside some other taller players that they've signed. The pod fave, Leah Cutting,
Plus
has
one.
come in.
Plus one.
Has plus one. Leah plus one Cutting has come through for the goods and has come inside with the Dons to back up Steph Wales. And that's really it. There was a few players that were cut from last year. The only notable out from the best 21 is Kat Phillips, and she's away because she's pregnant. So kept most of its star talent and really added some important players in important positions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. The backline recruiting was very, very targeted and very, very much needed. So I think that's going to serve them well. But we're not interested in defenders right now because we are going to be talking forwards, and one forward in particular. Liam, you had a very special guest for this episode.
I did. I had, for the first time in Clubs in Days and the podcast history, we had an interview with a player who is a fantasy fanatic, and that is Jess Wuetschner, former Brisbane Lion and current Essendon forward. Jumped on with me for an interview and had a great chat, not only about kind of moving down to an expansion club, but then applying that fantasy lens to talking about what the Bombers are going to be like in season 2023. It was an excellent conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get into it so that our viewers can hear it for themselves. Our listeners can hear it for themselves. So here it is, Liam talking to Jess Wuetschner.
Welcome, everyone, to today's interview for the Essendon episode of our 18 Clubs in 18 Days series, and I am joined by one of the Bombers' inaugural players, former leading goal kicker, and also first goal kicker for the Bombers last year, Jess Wuetschner. Jess, thank you so much for coming on. How are you?
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me, Liam.
No, we are more than grateful for you to come on. So, just to kind of jump off, last off-season and the kind of back end of season 6 was a pretty big change for you. How are you feeling now, kind of a little bit period on after season 7, after joining an expansion club like the Bombers?
Yeah, I think for myself personally, it was always going to be a bit of a challenge coming from an environment that I'd known for, 6 seasons to a new club again. Last year was obviously, I think we thought it was fairly good from our own perspective. but we've got a lot higher expectations coming into this season. So I'm really excited that the club has kept me on, and we're building towards hopefully a top 8 and some finals football this year.
Yeah, because having watched a lot of the Bombers games last year, as many of the listeners know, I am a avid Bombers supporter. It did definitely seem like it was quite a successful season. There were a number of wins against established clubs in the competition. But that kind of leads me on perfectly into another question I want to ask you. Obviously, coming from Brisbane, they were perennial contenders, and Craig is kind of talked about amongst the AFLW community as one of the really strong coaches. Was there much of a difference kind of culturally at the Bombers when you joined, or have you found that those same high standards that we understand are at Brisbane are also at the Bombers?
Yeah, I think it's probably a two-parter. I think that the environment itself is very different, and then also the high performance environment is probably a little bit different as well. So I think when you look at Brisbane, you obviously see the capacity that they have on the ground, and a lot of that is 6 years of work that we haven't quite had yet. But you can already see huge jumps in our program from last year into this year already, and see the girls have come back in such good condition that we've been able to really up our program, which has been really great in that sort of perspective. And then obviously the environment is different as well, different group of girls, different staff, all of that stuff. So yeah, it's been a good transition for me personally, coming from where I was personally at the Lions into where I'm at now at Essendon, and I really love the environment and the girls and just what we're building at the club.
Yeah, and I can imagine, and having had a bit of look at the roster, you were kind of the one of the more substantially experienced forwards. Has that been something that you kind of drew you to playing for the Bombers? The idea that you could kind of be a mentor for what was probably going to be a younger side, particularly in the forward line?
Yeah, I'm sure that was partly on their mind when they sort of approached me and wanted to see where my movements were at, even before I got delisted, but then especially after I got delisted. I think that they sort of also knew that I wasn't in my greatest space at the time as well. So their luring thing was for me to come down and enjoy my football again. And then when I was doing that, then bring that experience that I have. And I feel like I'm in a really good position now to do that, because I'm enjoying my football. I'm in a really good place. And now I want to just throw all the knowledge that I have towards the girls that are, really starting out their AFLW career.
Yeah. And I personally I think your message of really taking some time away to practice some good mental health and get yourself in the right place is a message that should be spread writ large. So it's great to hear that you are kind of back feeling like you're in your best place to play your best football. And that just kind of leads on to the next thing, which is you mentioned a little bit about the kind of expectations from last year from the Bombers. Is that generally, the coaching staff and management see this as a list for the top 8, for the top 4 winning finals? Is that something that's changed from last year? Or is it something that was kind of walk in the room day one and there was an expectation that this is a very talented roster even for an expansion club?
I don't think we haven't really talked about it. There hasn't been a huge discussion about the expectations. Even before we came in, it was, really quite rushed last season. So like, let's get a team together. Let's get training. Let's see what we can build from here. This year, I mean, it's pretty widely, I guess, known amongst us that we want to not be an expansion team anymore. We want to really just be a team that's in the competition, that's, going out to win every week and obviously vying for finals. And, once there's finals, and there's the second final and the third final, and, we want to make it to the end. Are we thinking maybe this year's our year? Maybe, maybe not. We just want to keep building and put ourselves in really good contention to, compete with the really top teams in the competition, your Melbourne's, Brisbane's, and, last year a couple of teams like Geelong really came along as well. So we're hoping to do something similar to them.
Yeah, the kind of stories of Geelong and then also the rapid rise of Richmond last year kind of present the model kind of a few superstar midfielders, but then also just a wealth of experience that comes from 2-3 years around in the AFL system. That's really interesting to hear. I'm going to move quickly away from the Bombers, and I'm going to ask you a quick question, or I'm going to give a quick introduction to those who don't know already know it. Jess, usually we have to ask people at the beginning whether or not they're aware of fantasy, and up until today, the answer has always been some variation of no or only a little bit. You are an avid AFL fantasy player and super coach. How have you ended up kind of playing that? How long have you been doing it for? Are you particularly successful? No judgment either way. I am a very average AFL fantasy player.
Yeah, I've played fantasy for probably 5 or 6 years now. It actually started when I was at the Lions. A few of us, I think it was about 16 or 18 of us, would get a team together and get a comp together, and we'd all chuck in $10 just between ourselves and play through the year. And I never won. I came runner-up a couple of times, but unfortunately, Brie Conan was an absolute superstar at fantasy, and no one ever really pipped her. So that's sort of how I got involved in fantasy, and this is my first year jumping on Supercoach as well, and it's not been a great year for me so far.
Yeah, look, Supercoach, it baffles. Well, it doesn't necessarily baffle me, but it does frustrate some of the mechanics. But this is a fantasy pod. We'll kind of stick to the fantasy scoring. And a quick follow-up, have you seen that there is AFLW fantasy / have you considered playing?
I jumped on board last season, and I did play a form of fantasy that I found through Twitter. Unfortunately, I put myself on the field, which I think was a bit of a downfall a little bit through the season, and I didn't do too well at that either. So it's certainly something that I'd love to get into, and I really wish that there was a proper AFL fantasy women's competition, because I'd be pretty on board with that. It'd be a lot easier mechanics, but it's good to see that there's sort of a bit coming through on the women's side as well.
Yeah, fingers crossed that there is some form of official AFLW AFL platform, because we're kind of really pushing for the same thing, for the same reasons. And I wasn't going to mention your personal scoring, but I'm sure you're aware that the medium forward role is not necessarily the most consistently high scoring role, even if very impactful. You probably get more Supercoach points if there was Supercoach scoring for the AFLW.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I'm a bit like you. I don't quite understand the full mechanics of Supercoach either. A player will have 35 disposals, 8 tackles, and still only score under 100. And I'm like, how does that even work? So
I just know that it's all about impact, supposed impact, like marks inside 50, tackles inside 50, clearances, handballs to advantage, all that stuff. I don't know the specifics of the scoring, but the high degree of variability in roles, it really did appear that at Essendon in particular, the chopping and changing of different positions kind of throughout the year was pretty substantial. Are you expecting positionally things to be more settled this year, or do you expect kind of more of that trialing different players in different areas? Kind of, is Bonnie Toogood potentially a midfielder? Is Ash Van Loon going to be a midfielder? Is Alana Barber a halfback?
That's a really, really great question. Probably one for Woody, our coach. But yeah, obviously last year with everything being all new and everything like that, throwing people around into positions that they maybe weren't comfortable with beforehand or had never played before was just something that I think gave us a few different looks and a few different options going forward. Obviously, it'd be great to have a couple of Bonnie Toogoods on the park to have one up forward and have one up in the middle as well. And
outrageous, ridiculous.
Yeah. Bonnie's one of my favourite players. But I mean, it's probably known. Like, we probably need some more support in the midfield for Maddie Prespakis. She does take a lot of the brunt of the midfield load, and as much as the girls came through there and supported her, we probably do need to find another A-grade midfielder. And I think that within our club, there's a few that could put their hand up and really become those that, could have some breakout years. So, it'll probably be a bit of chopping and changing early on, probably through the preseason. and we might find some players all over the park come round one.
Yeah, well, you said it perfectly yourself. You think there might be a few A-graders coming through. Feel free to give us whatever suggestions that you feel like you're comfortable giving, because the more information, the better.
Yeah, I mean, I think players like Jackie Vaught, probably even Steph Cain going through the midfield a bit more, I think they're going to get more comfortable and become really impactful players through the inside. One of my favourites, Bushy, Mia Bush, we get called Bushy and Wushy at training. It's quite confusing. Has been training the absolute house down. So I think she's someone that's going to have a really, really good year and probably break out onto the AFLW scene.
That's really interesting to hear, because another one that I thought you might mention is Amber Clark. We saw her play a more of an outside role as a very high draft pick last year, but having, being the Essendon nuffy that I have, watching the VFLW this year, and in the 4 or 5 games she was there, she was rolling through as an inside midfielder. Is that something that you expect could happen throughout the season, or is that kind of more of a wing potential chop and change later on?
Oh, look, she's probably a player that could play either roles. I think for myself, like if I was thinking about Amber, I think she's got speed to burn and I'd want her on the outside to use that. But at the same time, she's quite crafty inside as well. So you've got players like her, you've got Paige Scott as well, who chopped into the midfield a little bit, really strong body, young player who, always gives 110% into the contest. And so I think either of those two could probably roll through the midfield, and maybe one of them will grab a spot and really, put their name down there.
Yeah, and you basically stolen my next question from me, which is obviously you're probably one of the most settled members of that Bombers forward line throughout last year, and it was a litany of chopping and changing through the midfield. Bonnie was rucking or being an inside midfielder. Paige Scott was one player that I wanted to ask about. She burst out in Game 1 last year and just looked incredible, and then fluctuated throughout the year. And then the other player that I wanted to talk about was Daria Bannister, who also had some inside midfield time this year. And it sounds like, based on what you're saying, there's options aplenty, and it could be that just any one of them just kind of takes the opportunity.
Yeah, I think so. I think it'll be conversations between the players and the coaches as to, where they see themselves and then where the coaches see them. I'm sure there's probably plenty of conversations going on, probably not so much for me. I'm definitely not going to be rolling through the midfield in my career. But yeah, as you can see, Paige Scott and Daria Bannister are probably two of the stronger players in the contest and in their bodies that really can, go into the midfield and create that impact. Me personally, on a selfish note, wouldn't want Daria to leave the forward line, because I just love what she brings to the forward line down there, not only on the ground and in the air, but her tackle pressure is outstanding. So yeah, like you've said, there's probably a few options that they could roll through there. I'll leave that one up to the coaches.
Yeah. Come on, at this point, you've got to put your fantasy cap on and just be like, I want this. No, it's obviously doing research for this year and this interview, and just generally, you can kind of see that there are a litany of options at the Bombers, particularly kind of forward and midfield. However, free agency and draft, the free agency period this year for the Bombers was defined by defenders in Brooke Brown, Brooke Walker, and then also Georgia Clark, and then I don't know necessarily where Cody Jarks is going to be playing this season, but in the past she has played as a defensive player. You might not necessarily be training with them in the forward group, but you're probably training against them in any match sims. How has that group of defensive players fitted in this year, and kind of is there any one of them that stood out to you as one that's like really going to provide a force multiplier this year for the Bombers?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. We haven't actually split ourselves up into defensive, mid or forward groups yet. I think at the moment we're really just opening that door and conversation for anyone to sort of play anywhere in match sims or, any training drills, to, open up the opportunities for players in other positions that, maybe potentially wouldn't have come up. So, I mean, I'm super impressed by all the girls that have come in. Not only have they come in and they're all really good people that, have been really fun to get along with, but they've certainly brought some standards that have been really good for our group to drive those. And, I was super stoked when we got all those girls on board, especially Brooke Bowen and Brooke Walker, two players that have a lot of speed off the halfback, but can also play an intercepting role. So, yeah, as well as, Cody Jack, she can play forward, mid, back. It doesn't really matter. So, yeah, no, all the girls are really settling well. And, there's a couple others like Leah Cutting, who's also come along. And, yeah, so I'm just really stoked that they've all come to the club, honestly. I'm probably rambling a bit, but they're all really awesome girls.
No, it's great to hear. And obviously, kind of having watched the Bombers last year, the one thing you could kind of see, and it was obviously discussed after the season, was maybe a lack of tall defenders. So it's really fascinating to see that was very highly targeted at the beginning of free agency. Funny you mentioned Leah Cutting. She is actually a pod favourite because in AFLW Fantasy, the first season that they run it, I finished third overall by 1 point. And it was from a tap from Leah Cutting against Adelaide in the final game of the year with about 40 seconds to go. That was the difference. So
there you go.
I'm very aware of who Leah Cutting is. And that's actually, it's interesting to hear that as well, because obviously the beginning of last season was defined by Georgia going down right before the season start and putting Steph Killer in the ruck, kind of predominantly by herself as a relatively young and inexperienced player. So how has, and kind of leads me on to the next question, which is Leah comes in with some more experience at the level. Is it expected that the Bombers might run 2 rucks in the side next year? It will be a chop and changing game to game. What's the expectations there?
Yeah, I mean, we've also brought in Matilda Dyke. Sorry, Mia Dyke. Talking things. Matilda Dyke as well. And then, you've got your tools like Georgia Clark. I feel like any of these girls could sort of run through the ruck at any sort of chance that they needed to. So I don't know if it will necessarily be two predominantly ruck players that will play through there. I'm sure there's some games where we'll be matching up against some taller opponents that, we might need to have the 2 ruck rotation. I just know that it's really good for Killer to have someone else at training to really work her craft with. Obviously, it was disappointing for Georgia to go down, and Killer was kind of working her ruck craft with Andrew Phillips all by herself a little bit. But yeah, like I said, with Georgia Clark, Matilda Dyke and Leah Cutting coming in, I think any of them could play that role as the second or even first ruck. I shouldn't just assume that Killer will get the number 1 role, but she did so well last year. It's hard to not see that. Yeah,
she definitely looks like she came on at the back end of the year, and also was kicking goals a few times as well, and got a rising star nom in that game against West Coast, which was very exciting to see. So we're getting to the point now. We get asked this question after the end of every interview that we have with players, and you're no doubt aware of why we're asking this. Fantasy is a game all about finding undervalued players, or players that kind of break out from relative lack, from a very, when they're less known. Seriously, sometimes I can't get words out. Being in the position that you're in at the Bombers as kind of a more experienced player, who is your pick to most improve and break out in 2023?
Ooh, that's a tough one. If we're looking at value players, I was the cheapest last year, but I wouldn't recommend that. No, I think I sort of touched on it earlier. I think that Mia Bush, the way she's training at the moment, can't not be picked. So whether that's in the back line or rolling through the midfield wing, something like that, I think she's super versatile. And then if you're looking at some players, particularly from sort of this draft, not that we really picked up too many in the draft, but some of the younger players that are coming through, I think there's a possibility that someone like a Matilda Dyke will play. She's super versatile.
Interesting.
Can play, in the ruck, could play half forward, half back. And from that perspective, if we're thinking fantasy wise, I think that if I'm going to have one person that's genuinely going to break out, if she hasn't already in my eyes, is probably Renee Tierney. I think she's going to snap up a role in probably the forward line. And she's been training really well as well. So I can't see her not getting a game and really breaking out.
Fantastic. That is more than we could possibly ask for information-wise. And now we've got a wealth of names from a team that, as I'm sure you can understand, there is already a whole bunch of different options, just given the midfield spots that are available and then kind of the positional versatility of a number of players. So that ends our chat today. Thank you so much for coming on, and thank you as well for being fantasy specific when the conversation dictated. We really do appreciate you coming on.
No worries, appreciate it.
Awesome. Thanks everyone. Chat soon.
Great stuff there, Liam. Interesting to get a fantasy lens from a player because, as you said before we ran through that interview, it's quite rare for the players to have that fantasy side of things, so it was really great to hear.
Yeah, and obviously when we interview players, we don't need the fantasy insight. We don't need them to have played, but knowing that it's when I'm talking about players and I'm trying to lead towards who's going to be more in the midfield, knowing why I'm asking that question certainly makes a big difference. So, yeah, great chat.
Yep. And speaking of knowing who's going to be in that midfield, that is a great segue into your top 5 most interesting players from a fantasy perspective for Essendon. Launch into number 1 because I know you've been very excited to talk about this player.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. It's Georgia Nanscawen. Big G. Was cruelly robbed of us last year to be playing in our side. She was all but guaranteed, basically before the season they've been launched, she was going to be my number 1 midfielder. And then she does her ACL in the third quarter of the VFLW Grand Final, which she was dominating, by the way. She had 110 points in the third quarter. She was a freaking gun. Now, she's had an extra long off-season, basically has been fully fit for a couple of months now and has only not started the preseason because of another, small elbow injury, I believe. But she's an absolute gun. Averages 108 at VFLW level. She's trained previously and played a couple of games in the AFLW in 2021 for North Melbourne. She's also a former hockey roo. So, professional athlete, clearly has a fantasy pedigree. And I don't think at any point in her VFLW career has she had a score below 80. She's a freak. She's a gun.
One of those people that's just annoyingly good at everything when it comes to sport. And you said it before, she was going to be our biggest lock as a rookie last season. And I think she's just going to carry that over straight into this season.
Guaranteed. Without a second or shadow of doubt. No matter how good we thought that, Eilish Sheeran, she's basically, I think, the Eilish Sheeran of this year. The player that could come in and immediately be basement priced and average 50, 60.
All-Australian team as well. That'd be pretty handy for the Bombers.
Okay, yeah, that might be a little bit far. I'm not going to pump her. I'm not going to pump her up that much because it's a very, very tough midfield to get into. But she's going to be basement priced. I just can't see a world where she's not in my team round 1. It's as simple as that. She'll be the first name I pick on the team sheet.
Absolutely agree. And I'm just going to put this to here. If she gets All-Australian this season, you heard it here first.
That would be a ridiculous call. That would be...
Ridiculous calls are basically my thing. It's why I've got a section named the Will Special. So I think it's probably fair from us.
And to kind of take it another step outside of me just talking about how much I love G Nanscawen. The other thing that we get from it is the Bombers really did struggle to nail down a third midfielder last year. And I think that was the biggest kind of, if you could point to one issue, it was the fact that there wasn't a natural third option because they started the year trying to chop and change between, Paige Scott or Joanne Doonan. So some players who'd slightly smaller bodies, some players with AFLW experience, some without. They eventually settled on Maddie Prespakis. And then what I think was an inspired choice in Steph Cain, who's got the kind of all-around midfield capability, kind of got a little bit of size, a little bit of running, good kick. But there was never that third option. It was chopping and changing throughout the season. Jackie Vott, Mills Radford. There were games at the beginning of the season with Joanne Doonan. Paige Scott got a run through the midfield. Lily Rose Williamson, when she was playing in the side and looked great, particularly in game one, was getting run through in there. Daria Bannister had an absolutely outstanding game one round against Geelong, where she had 71% midfield time, and I think scored a high score of the year there as well. But no one that really stood out as like this is the player who's going to really take us to the next level. This is the one to lock it in. And I think that's because deep down, I reckon they knew Jean Nanscawen was going to be that player when they were making this list.
Yeah, and I love the way you say that Essendon's midfield just settled for a W Award winner in Maddie Prespakis in there.
Settled into a rhythm, not settled as though she wasn't the marquee selection when they made the team.
But you have mentioned in that list of players who have gone through that midfield, your number 2 player. So we'll move on to number 2. Who's your number 2, Liam?
So number 2 was a little bit more difficult because I think the kind of next 2 players sit a couple of rungs below in the fantasy like super hierarchy of players I want on my side. Number 2 was another player that we talked about a lot during the season last year, and that's Paige Scott, who is, like, I know that we really hate, like, AFLM comparisons, but her striking similarity to what Jake Stringer does for the men's team of the Bombers is almost, like, too hard to look away from. Like, she has an extreme amount of power. She's a great mark. She is a bit of a bully sometimes. And that bully kind of mentality when the ball was on the ground was sometimes wildly swinging in our favour. She loved to tackle, particularly when she had CBAs. And then other times it was woefully against us because she would get frustrated that she hadn't been near the ball, give away about 4 free kicks in a minute. And I might be exaggerating with a minute, but it may have actually been less than 5 minutes. She gave away 4 free kicks in a fourth quarter against West Coast when every single other person was scoring. No, I'm not bitter about it.
Yeah, and that was the thing I was going to bring up, which is she's such an insanely talented player, but in terms of the fantasy, she gives away so many free kicks, which really hurts, especially in the AFLW. And we can't talk about Paige Scott without talking about her lowest score of last year.
Yeah, that was bad, wasn't it?
Yep. Can you remind everyone what that might have been?
-1. It was -1. Now, thankfully, she wasn't in my side. RIP if you had still in yours. But a -1 against Brisbane. Now, no one from the Bombers really did that well against Brisbane. Like, let's be fundamentally clear. Like, Maddie Prespakis had 100, and then there were, a handful of scores. There was one other score above 70, and then there was a lot below 40. It was an absolute capitulation. Shout out, though, to Danny Marshall, who broke the record in that game for most D50 exit kicks. I think it was like 14, which is too higher than the record previously, and that's because Brisbane bloody couldn't kick straight.
Yep.
But Paige Scott, wildly inconsistent, both in her impact on the game, but then also her fantasy scoring. Highs of 70, and then a low of -1.
And I think it's really important as well to say, first season, 18 years old, if that consistency can come this season, fantastic, but she's going to be one to keep an eye on in future seasons because you know that she's going to have a season where she absolutely explodes.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things as well where I'd be trepidatious this year picking her, but I can see at least 10 points of upside just from another off-season, and then a score in there where it's not -1, it's 40, and that takes her average up from 4. She'll be priced at, 41?
Yeah, 41.
Which will be in an interesting area for forwards. It'll price her kind of below the Hannah Ewings of the world and a little bit below, oh my God, what's her name from West Coast? The other forward who was taken in the draft.
Oh, Ella Roberts.
Ella Roberts. Priced a little bit, like kind of in that area. I think she probably has the lowest floor by far of the three of them.
A negative score is a pretty low floor.
Yes, that is. I can't think of many fantasy relevant players I've discussed having floors in the negatives, but she's just like so extremely talented, and she looked so good in those games in the midfield that she's a watch at the very, very minimum because she has that potential.
Yep, classic Will watch and wait there. We'll move on to your number 3 pick, and this is a player who we've already mentioned is a big inclusion, and it's what she can do in the back half that's really, really important. Liam, who's your number 3?
Brooke Brown comes in, she'll be priced at 54. We've seen what she can do at North Melbourne, and that's in a side competing for the top 4 with other defenders who can also score. Like you'll hear us, we'll have a chat later in the year with a North Melbourne player, and it's a laundry list of possibilities of players to take marks in that back line. And, in previous years, she'd had, Jess Duffin already back there. She'd had Emma Carney taking points away. And she'd even then managed to take her average up from 11 in her first season up to a pretty good level at 53, which kind of puts her in maybe tier 3, tier 4 of defenders.
Yeah. You're probably looking at it maybe at best a D3 with that sort of average, I'd say.
Yeah, I'm thinking more like in terms of like top 6 or like top 5. Like if you put them as tiers, there's the 70 or 80 averaging ones. Then you kind of get into the 60s, and then maybe those mid-50s. And Brooke Brown would have been a good pick a couple of years ago. Didn't really do much extra last year, but showed that it wasn't just a flash in the pan and has that capability. I'm of the mind that she's guaranteed to be a defender, and she'll have the additional advantage of she'll easily be the tallest defender at the Bombers who will play every game. There's clearly no one necessarily owned all the kick-ins last year. I would have said that it was like maybe half to Danny Marshall, a quarter to Elise Gamble, and then a smattering to players that were coming in and out of the side, Ash Van Loon, Morks, Sophie Van der Heuvel. There is definitely
half of those Danny Marshall ones came from that Brisbane game as well, I reckon.
I'm not kidding. 8 of 27 came in that Brisbane game. It's ridiculous. But I think if you were looking to kind of create your side, and we really are struggling for that D3 option, I think you'd do a lot worse than Brooke Brown because I just don't see it getting worse.
Yeah, I can see Brooke Brown quite easily averaging 60, which is a 6-point upside, earn a little bit of money. I think that you're right. She's got a thumping kick, Brooke Brown, which will definitely appeal to the North coaching group as someone who can take those kick-outs, but also someone who can sort of be that outlet player as well. So I definitely think there is a fair bit of upside there, and it's a player that might find her way into my team depending on how my team structures up.
And think about it this way, we both rate massively Charlie Thomas at West Coast. Charlie Thomas averaged 59, Brooke Brown averaged 53. I would say pretty comfortably that I reckon Brooke Brown has more upside than Charlie Brown.
Charlie Brown.
Charlie Brown. Yep, that's exactly who I meant to say.
Yep, going straight to peanuts here, but
yes. I honestly, I would be pretty comfortable in saying that Brooke Brown a 60, and then that's not that far off. We had Katie Lynch both on our sides last year. She averaged 62.
Oh, I didn't have Katie Lynch, and I was very happy not to because she was very frustrating.
That was such a roller coaster.
Okay,
we're getting sidetracked here. We could talk about last season for far too long. I just reckon Brooke Brown is another player that when we come around to making our side, you could make a lot worse choices for players with that kind of upside. Particularly in a year where we don't really have we don't have that defender who's going to become a midfielder. There's not a slam dunk up front for us to take.
Yeah, I agree. And I think she is a really good option in that regard. And we've talked a bit about, Essendon being a side that probably gets a few more entries into their forward line, so that helps as well. So, yeah, I can see a lot of upside for Brooke Brown. I'm going to keep the peanuts theme going because the next player you've picked is someone who's going to be worth peanuts, which is what we love to hear from our rookies. Who you've got at number 4?
That was slick. That was
Thank you.
very,
I was pretty proud of that
slick.
one. I was pretty proud of that one.
So the fourth player on the list is coming off the back of Jess Wuetschner's recommendation, and that's Mia Bush. And that's mainly because she will be a bargain-priced defender who sounds like she might have some midfield time. And that's kind of it, really.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm pretty happy with that, to be honest.
how bad can it be? Like, we had Bridie Kennedy in our side last year. She was 30, 35. Like, we just need something ticking over that's not, like, in the teens. Now, I'm going to caveat this by saying she didn't exactly average a lot last year, Mia Bush. She, averaged 22 and a half in her 2 games. But from what Jess was saying, and, she'd not only know kind of having been around some good players, but then also being a fantasy watcher and player, would kind of know what to expect of players that look like they're going to take the jump. I'm going to take her word for it. She's going to go on my list of players that I'm watching in the preseason. And if she's playing round 1, there's any possibility she's at my D6.
Yeah, I can't fault that, to be honest.
There's not really much to argue about. There's not a massive amount of scoring pedigree, but potential midfielder, defensive status, rookie. So be it. Chuck her in.
Absolutely. Speaking of midfielders, number 5, we've got someone who's at the complete opposite end of the scoring scale.
Spectrum.
Liam, number 5, who have you got?
I've got Maddie P. And, it's mainly because, I love the Dons, but it was not exactly easy to come up with, super fantasy relevant options for this year. As hard as it is to admit that, we're not stacked with a million different players to select. There wasn't necessarily some really, a full laundry list, Sydney style of 14 different players I want to pick. Maddie Prespakis is someone I'm putting on there because in all likelihood, all it takes is one bad game at the beginning of the year and she's immediately an upgrade target.
Yep. Completely agree.
And that's the main way to think about it because she has the capacity to dominate in a midfield kind of unchecked by anyone else. Thinking about the Bombers' scorers last year, it was Maddie averaging basically 90, and then the next highest averaging midfielder was 62 in Steph Cain, who had a good season. There's no other player in there that's taking points away from her.
What about Nanscawen?
Fuck. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And funnily enough, I was talking to someone who talked about the fact that part of the reason why Georgia Nanscawen is such a good midfielder is because she is so good with the ball of her feet. And that's because as a hockey player, she's probably faster running with her hands on the ground than she is standing upright. Which, hilarious, and also, of course, that makes perfect sense. I don't know. I just think that all it takes is one bad game from Maddie Prespakis and she'll be someone that we'll be trading in. She has the ceiling, even in games where the Bombers are getting smacked, she can score, hundreds, 110s. She had one bad game against Sydney, and that's because she was tagged like it was going out of fashion by, one of the few teams that was running a dedicated hard tag out of anyone in the comp. I can't see. I just don't see her being that bad. Even if she drops 4 points of upside, all it takes is one bad game, and then she'll be going down, priced at 80, bang, get her in.
I agree. And her 3-game run from round 5 to round 7, 111, 100, 111 again, against some pretty good opposition in Collingwood and Brisbane, and then Geelong, who were quite stingy on the points. You know what you're going to get from Prespakis. So I think maybe not one to start with, but definitely an upgrade target later in the season. And I think it could be quite a unique one.
Definitely not a player to start with. I'm not starting with Maddie Prespakis, but she's definitely a player that's one of those first step upgrade targets. I need one tagged game, and bang, she'll be into my side a week later.
Yeah, sounds good. Now,
Will, I get to throw to you for the Will special.
The Will special. I've gone for a player who was also a draftee last season.
Hang on. You're not picking someone that's over 30. It's not a Will special.
No. Well, my Will special are either wildly speculative youngsters or experienced players who I think will come good again. And I'm going for the wildly speculative youngster this time. And it's not really that speculative because she's a former pick 4, and that's Amber Clark.
Speculative picks a player in a bumper draft who goes to top 5.
Yep, Amber Clark. She looked good in season 7, and you can definitely attest a bit more to that because you were a keen watcher of the Bombers, as you'd expect from a Bombers supporter. But we know she's going to be super talented. She's a small chance to be listed as a forward. At this stage, we're probably expecting her to be a midfielder, so she might end up being one of those players you pick as a cheaper option who can
awkward.
Yeah, who can just jump up. Expect improvement in a midfield role, but if you've got Nanscawen sitting there, go for Nanscawen.
Yeah, I will say that the Bombers are clearly thinking of her long term as a midfielder. They had her playing a bunch of VFLW games in the off season as a much more pure inside midfielder, whereas last year she was a half forward wing. I think the thing that will really scupper that in the AFLW side this season is the fact that Kat Phillips is out, and Amber Clark is a very natural full time winger. She has that speed. She could probably, learn to get, could definitely do with a bit of time to get a bit stronger. But I'm not necessarily thinking about her fantasy-wise this year. I think long-term, she'll be a player that she will probably own, because she does have those kind of game-baking traits that a team will look to put through and get the ball to more, but not this year.
Yeah, agreed. Well, I think we'll leave it there for Essendon. Hope you've had a great time listening to us. I hope, Liam, you've had a great time talking, because I know you love talking the Bombers. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to our Clubs in Days. We have another exciting episode coming to you very, very shortly in the Fremantle episode. You can also check our socials for the best 21s for Essendon, which will be out now. So go check those out. You can find all those things at FreeKickWPod on Twitter and on Instagram, Threads, all those various meta things that are now existing. And you can also find me on Twitter and on Instagram at WillH_VI. And Liam, where can they find you?
And you can find me on Twitter at LiamAFLW Fantasy.
Very good. Thank you everyone for listening, and we will catch you next time.